So
Okay.
we're recording right now, and this is on May 1st of 2020 in the afternoon. Recording, we have with us Kristin Dillinger, lead horticulturist from Lakewold Gardens. And indeed, this was scheduled, of course, to be our April program for our Master Gardener meeting of Grays Harbor and Pacific counties. Unfortunately, due to the quarantine restrictions, we obviously are having to meet this way. So our intent here with this program is to share the program that Kristin had planned to present with us and share with us on the 14th of April, and have this available to all of our Master Gardener members for their viewing interest and pleasure, and for their follow-up with Kristin and with the gardens. Should we have access and time and interest. With that, let me introduce Kristin. Take it over.
Thanks so much. In the creation and use of public gardens, we honor what it means to be human. Gardens honor our connection to nature, to family and our community, and also our need to continue to learn and explore. This talk provides a glimpse into Lakewold Gardens, a 100-year-old, 10-acre estate garden in Lakewood, and how it lives its mission of historic preservation in order to inspire its visitors and change lives. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history, because the property is 100 years old, and it has had, well, technically 4, but really 3 families that had lived on it. And this was the original house on the property, kind of a craftsman style. And the original family on site were the Alexanders, and we have a rose on the back of the house now that is Mrs. Alexander, named by the Seattle Garden Club for the original owner of the property. Probably in the late 20s, the rose was named. The Griggs purchased the property from the Alexanders, and then the Wagners after that. So this is another view of the house and parts of the garden. And this brick walkway was put in 1918, and it is speculated that it was installed when work was being done on neighboring Thornwood Castle, which was done by the Olmsted firm that did Central Park and the boulevards in Seattle. We do not have documentation to authenticate that assumption, but the work is very much reminiscent of the work you would see on other Olmsted projects. And the fence, our historic fence out front, is also of the same time period and likely also designed by them. When the Wagners purchased the property in the 1940s, it still had the wooden shake house on it, and they decided in the 50s to do a renovation, and in conjunction with an architect, they hired Thomas Church, a landscape architect out of California. And he is nationally recognized as one of the pioneer landscape designers of modernism in gardens. And it's commonly known as the California style. And Mrs. Wagner and Thomas Church had an ongoing relationship, and he would come up and do projects on a yearly basis. And here he is sitting in the sunroom that he designed with the parterres and the tea house behind. And he was also instrumental in this design of the tea house, which replaced an old glass, more Victorian-looking structure with something that was wood and cedar and felt more Northwest. He was also instrumental in changing the access to the front of the house and creating what we call Circle Drive. And this rhododendron is placed on Circle Drive. And what he wanted was a grand sweeping drive that gave you glimpses of the house before you finally got this this view as you rounded the corner and across the big lawn. Here's another sort of view of that same space, but from in front of the house looking back. And Thomas Church had some really important guiding principles, and we'll talk through those a little bit, because they really underscore the work that we're doing today. So actually, I'm going to go back to that previous slide. Scale is sort of the most important principle for church. And he said the best rule is, when in doubt, make it larger. The eye detects a meager dimension more easily than it does a too generous one. And so he made this lawn extremely large because he knew that the Douglas fir trees surrounding it were going to grow, and he wanted the scale to be appropriate to the size of the trees. And he was afraid that if the lawn was too small, as the trees grew, it would feel closed in. So the large lawn gives it the openness. The second principle is function. And so in designing Circle Drive to the front of the house, he also created what is called a forecourt, this gravel parking area in front of the house. And his point was that they were a family that was going to be entertaining regularly, and you didn't want your visitors' cars to be parked out on the street. You wanted to bring them into the house and provide easy access from the parking lot to the foyer. So here's another view of that same space in a different season. The function principle also relates to things like garbage bins and tool sheds and vegetable gardens, that you start with a garden design by placing those in places that were unobtrusive but orderly. And it used to be that on the mudroom side of the house, there were garbage cans that were sunken into the ground so that the lids sat at ground level, and all you did was pull the lid off, throw your trash in, put it back, so that you didn't actually have the view of the can sticking up and in the way. They became safety hazards for us. We were tripping on the top of the cans. So they were recently removed and gravel placed in that spot instead. But it was an interesting example of this principle that was really important to him in his work. The next principle was utility. He wanted the doors and windows and access points to lead to livable spaces. He didn't want doors that went to basically to nowhere, and in some houses you'll see that. So a lot of work was done when the house was restored to add that sunroom, so that you felt inside the house as if you were already outside, and to join the two spaces, the indoors and the outdoors. And here's another shot of the veranda and this concept of utility, this extended living space outside. The knot garden also represents utility. This is his original drawing for the space, and this herb garden sits right outside the kitchen, so that it's just a quick walk to grab whatever herb was needed. So he was careful about selecting locations. I'm going to back up. I think that it's a lot like the concepts of permaculture, where you have zones and you put closest to the house the things that you need most often. So he was ahead of his time in terms of thoughts on this.
You know, I have to interject, even at this time, Kristin, right? You know, how novel, you know, all of this indeed must have been at the time, how groundbreaking this must have been at the time.
Right,
because these,
70 years ago, yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just, because it truly is the function, the sense of function, the sense of utility. It's seems so very refreshing, and well, so very modern, if you will, in our own view. And
Correct.
it had truly to be just remarkable at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Who all remind us who all was funding all this activity? Where'd the money come from?
So the family, the Wagner family, were in the timber industry, and so they were attending timber conferences and bringing back specimen plants and traveling the world and meeting people and making connections that way, which gave them access to what at the time was cutting edge plant material that other people probably didn't have access to, but also a disposable income that allowed them to cultivate a garden of this size and maintain it. There were times where there were as many as 12 people on staff. We don't have that luxury now. So
Continue on. It's really fascinating. Great pictures, by the way.
thank you. So the next principle is simplicity. And I thought this image of the Dawn Redwood from the lower slope really articulates this well. He said, too many things going on in a small space produces a restless quality which will leave the onlooker dissatisfied. And I love his phrasing, but I also really love what the simplicity of just that one big focal point in the middle of the lawn does for this space. And I think we are too quick to busy things up. And Thomas Church didn't think of plants as ornaments for houses. He thought of them as a way to create livable space. And maybe that is, having lived and worked in a warmer climate, where that comes from. I think we in the Northwest forget about that with some of the rain we get. Another principle for him was geometry and repetition in geometry. And so if you'll remember, the herb garden also has this same form, this quatrefoil, and he repeated it here in the pool. We recently did massive work on the pool. So last summer we drained it, and all of the old paint was sandblasted off to provide a clean surface for a new plaster. And the plaster was dyed this green so that it didn't have to be painted. The restoration company we worked with said because some of the piping was still copper, the copper would have dyed a white pool or another color. So it made sense that the color chosen was kind of the patina that copper would have created anyway.
I'm fascinated by the point that you're saying that the pool, after all these years, was still relatively functioning.
Yeah, it is. It's not heated. You can't swim in it. We use it simply as a water feature. An elegant water feature, but we do maintain it. I mean, we still, chlorinate it to keep the algae out and brush it. And so this summer we will redrain it and we will do the tile work around the top and replace those lights that you see that were taken out, hopefully with something that's functional so that at night it will be lit again. But maintaining old properties, it's not just about the plant material, but it's about these legacy structures as well. And remembering that essentially you are rebuilding it. Every building on a property has to be re-roofed and repainted, and you're really doing all the work all over again in taking care of maintenance. So it's an expensive proposition. And then geometry is also seen here in the parterre beds, and again that quatrefoil is repeated. So he liked repetition of geometric shapes.
Now, relative to the hedges that are there, these certainly cannot be the original plants. Is that right? There must be some. These must be redones or.
There's probably some original in there. Maybe we keep a back stock of box, and when a plant dies out, we replace that individual. But I have not found records that the entire box hedges were ever replaced. So maybe they've all been replaced individually over time, if that makes sense.
And to that point, the property has been maintained throughout history now? I mean, that is
correct.
So there's never been a time of blatant neglect.
No.
Right?
So it was a residence and lived in until 1991. It was open to the public as a public garden in last year. It was our 30th anniversary last year. So in '89, and but Mrs. Wagner was still living in the residence at the time, and did so for another 2 years. And so it passed from her hands into the 501c3 that currently operates it, and has for the last 30 years. So yes, it has always had some level of maintenance since the original structures were placed on it. Different families took different focus. In fact, the Wagners in the 1940s put victory gardens in these parterre beds, and then replanted with roses later, and then annuals and bulbs were kind of the last phase. Here's another view of the brick walk, and again, that tea house structure that we saw earlier. And this is a popular view. And another structure that we work hard to maintain. So last summer, another big thing we were doing while the pool restoration folks were working on the pool, we pruned all that rose off that structure, and it took 16 feet of scaffolding set up in the middle of that, with us on top of the scaffold with extending orchard pruning equipment to get all the rose off. And the reason we did it was that as that cedar aged, the architect said the biggest risk to the structure was not surrounding trees, but the sheer weight of the rose. And it took us 16 workman loads of material to get it all cleared. And I'm estimating that it was in the thousands of pounds. So I think he was probably accurate. So we're going to maintain it kind of at the second rung, the climbing rose, from here on out, until those slats can be replaced.
It's stunning to think about the age and and still the health of that plant material after all those years.
Yes, indeed. That's a Kathleen rose. It's a fragrant climber. And yeah, it's vigorous. It'll easily put on 10 feet a year. This is a special tree for us. This is the wolf tree. And various stories are told about why it's called a wolf tree, but obviously it's a Douglas fir that had its dominant leader damaged when it was young, and it took an interesting path in its growth. And Mrs. Wagner had a really hard time figuring out what to do with this tree, and so Thomas Church said, let's put a shade garden below it and feature it, instead of thinking of it as an eyesore. And it has become one of our favorite trees in the garden. Some stories say that loggers called trees that they could not figure out how they were going to fall wolf trees. But I have also heard trees that were growing in open areas where branches were allowed to grow all the way to the ground because there weren't other trees in close proximity that shaded them out, were also called wolf trees in historic documents. So it could have gotten its name from either place. Under that, we have Trillium kurabashi growing, and this is a native Trillium to the region. And then I've got some shots of kind of the woodland area, and Mrs. Wagner and Thomas Church disagreed on this whole section of the garden. So the upper, more formal areas he was actively involved in. And as you get closer to the lake, because the 10 acres sits on gravelly lake, the garden slopes dramatically. And Mrs. Wagner said she wanted a water feature that was a series of pools with water recirculating from the lake, and she wanted a rock garden. And Thomas Church thought that that was too much. It didn't follow the principles of simplicity the way he envisioned them. It meant an abundance of collector plants in one location. And it has become really one of the magical areas of the garden. And I want to quickly share a story from Dan Hinckley about this space. He talks about the fact that as a young graduate student, he was a keen apprentice to gardening, newly arrived from the hypothermic climate of the northern Midwest, and he found the notion that he might come upon a plant in its floral zenith or possessing transformative foliar effects at any month of the calendar intoxicating. Surrounding the cottage itself, the cottage where he lived at the time, in one of the best collections of woody plants in North America were hardy palms and winter-flowering camellias. He was living at the time in the UW Arboretum, and fir trees from Chile and dove trees from China, and he says his appetite to learn as well as possess was ravenous. And when he left the university with his degree in 1985 and armed with a lofty plenitude of Latin binomials and an incalculable number of trees, shrubs, and vines growing in 4-inch pots, and an unfortunate aside, virtually no idea how to gather them together to make a garden. As an unexpected consequence, it was his exposure early on as a Pacific Northwest horticulturalist to those who could assimilate artfully the plants they so passionately collected that forever changed his vision of what a garden in its truest sense could be. It was during that first visit to Lakewold that he encountered a superb collection of plants, both woody and herbaceous, that seemed immediately less a chaotic library and more a contemplative ordering and celebration of diversity.
Now that's incredibly significant. You're saying, so this article is basically testimony to Hinckley's, this is a key part of what Hinckley has become, how he grew.
And, right. And he continues, and he says, although I was still well away from my own attempt at making a garden, the seeds were sown on that day for what I had hoped to ultimately achieve when I had my chance. Yet it is unlikely that I could possibly have articulated that thought on that day, nor is it likely that I would even have attempted to. As youth are known for doing too well, I did not fully acknowledge those who had been and were still in the presence of changing the horticultural fabric of where I now garden. They had been acquiring, evaluating, and extolling or lamenting the virtues of plants appropriate for our region for a long time before my very germination. It was the solid foundation that Eulalie Wagner, along with numerous other contemporaries, had built that expanded our collective horizons. The cure of the passionate gardener's garden is that its framework loses its novelty as it matures. Not acknowledged in this anathema is the fact that the novelty has worn thin on plants they chose to grow because they have now been mainstreamed in commerce. They are now commonplace because they were ultimately deemed good plants deserving of wider recognition in regional landscapes. So yes, exactly. We have, one of the top plant explorers in the world saying that he credits Mrs. Wagner for teaching him how to put a garden and a collection together, and for doing that testing out of unusual plant material way back when, and falling in love with different genuses and exploring them fully. And so we're looking at rhododendron pictures because Mrs. Wagner had over 900 of them. And so this one here is white pearl. No, sorry, that was a William Sienum cultivar. This is white pearl. And she also had almost 30 camellias. This is Masterpiece. She has 25 plus Japanese maples. This is Shinda Shoujo that emerges with pink foliage in the spring and fades to green and then back to red again. And this is another glimpse of the woodland garden and her waterfall system.
And so, to be clear, the structure and composition we're looking at was primarily hers at this point and not Church's.
Not churches, correct. Yep. Thomas Church is really influential in the upper portion of the garden, the formal areas. And in the naturalistic portion, it's really all Eulalie Wagner's design. And then this is Acer palmatum goshiki. And this is just a magnificent specimen now. And Clerodendron Thomsonii. And to finish with Dan Hinckley's thought, you know, though I am not as mature as Mrs. Wagner was on the first day we met in the mid-1980s to admire her blue poppies, I am sufficiently hardened off to now recognize that her lasting legacy was not necessarily the elevating of our adventurous spirits and her demands that we take a few risks in our plants. Today, both her generosity and that of her family ensure that Lakewold can continue to invite, instruct, and inspire for generations. I look forward to returning to it on a regular basis to admire and to watch the collection mature, evolve, and transmute as all good gardens should. So what that brings us to is the other parts of the garden, what we have become to the community that uses the space, and the care that we now give this collection that she so lovingly gathered. This image is a Douglas fir, but this happened this spring. We had all of the big trees evaluated for risk last year, and then 3 trees were selected as potentially issues, and we had sonic tomography done on them, which at the base of the tree basically uses sound to determine whether or not it's solid and how much decay there is. And then we followed up that with a climbing evaluation. And so that's, this tree had been hit by lightning, and it has kind of a 30-foot section of it with significant scarring and reaction wood. And once they climbed it, they determined that that reaction wood was actually kind of spiraling up the tree, and that to have done any reduction on it would actually have reduced the function of that new wood and made it less safe. So they decided ultimately not to do any work, which just is really a testament to good arboriculture process, and, you know, dotting all your I's and crossing your T's before you do any pruning. Volunteer opportunities abound in the garden, and this is an image of a work party that potted all the bulbs that are in the parterres right now. Actually, we've discovered that a really effective method for mass planting of bulbs is actually putting them in pots, and then we pot the pots in the beds, so that when the tulips and daffs start to go through that ugly phase as they're storing energy for next year, we just pop the pots and go put them in our service area. They can still store the energy they need, but that's not happening in public view anymore. So then we can then plant out the next round of seasonal color without waiting for them to finish. Other volunteer activities, we have a partnership with the Northwest Perennial Alliance, and their local chapter, the Petal Pushers, maintains this hydrangea garden for us. And there's also a Hinckley connection here. Dan Hinckley was involved in a visioning process a number of years back, and said that none of the Northwest Public Gardens really had a comprehensive hydrangea collection. And so he donated some material to the Petal Pushers, which is included in this space, to kind of jumpstart that process of building a hydrangea collection. We also have classes, the program we call Learn in the Garden, and this is George Lash here doing a lecture on hydrangeas. And we've had clematis classes, and how to prune big trees, and fine Japanese maple pruning, and a lot of it actually happens out in the garden in addition to slideshows in the Wagner house. Other things that happen, Yoga Wild. There's a Tacoma group that does yoga out in the open, and they have partnered with us for Sunday evening programming. And so they move around the garden. They're not always in the same space, but here they are next to the shade garden and the wolf tree, enjoying the tranquility and the green. We also do pop-up art shows in the house. and give artists that may not get galleries time yet an opportunity to show their work. And we're installing some track lighting this year to better utilize the house for this purpose. We've also got a partnership with Write 253 in Tacoma. They are a poetry program, and they have experienced poets that come and do readings and then invite youth poets to join them and read as well. And it's promoting youth engagement in writing. We also have a great program called Music from Home, where we are becoming a destination alternative classical venue. And we're featuring artists of color and women composers who may not be getting the big concert hall bookings that they so very deserve. Another Music from Home shot, just amazing. Oh, my computer has locked up temporarily here. Not sure why that is, but it does not want to move on to the next slide. So, ooh.
Well, it waits.
There we go.
There you go. But just as a bridge, though, I'm curious, when did the programs begin? Has this always been a charter of the gardens to have, to show, have a deeper appreciation of the arts and education and youth engagement, or is this a new, relatively recent evolution?
I guess going back to the Wagner family, they were deep appreciators of the art and some of the founding members of the Tacoma Art Museum. And so their house was loaded with art. And so the new programming that was launched this past year in 19 is to honor that connection to the community. That was another founding kind of principle of them as a family. But yeah, you're right. It is, a lot of this is relatively new. There had been kind of traditional programming that had happened year after year at Lakewold, the same thing every year. And we decided to mix it up and to do some new stuff and see what resonated with people. And a lot of it aimed at drawing a younger crowd. So Music from Home, for example, is a really casual music environment where people don't feel compelled to dress up the way you might going to a big concert hall. So we've got children tagging along and sitting on the floor on pillows or bringing their own blankets and enjoying music. And so recognizing that gardens need people that love them and trying to find opportunities to cultivate that connection to young people in any way we can. These images are from our last community day last August. And the little girl with the pot in her hand in the bottom left, that was a partnership with Watson's. They came out and did seed starting. And then the mural making, we hired a muralist to do a drawing, and then the community got to paint it. We had the Audubon doing birding tours, and the Cubs, or the Boy Scouts, were out teaching flag folding. So lots going on, and this is the finished mural, which is really a nice welcome on the entry pathway to the garden. Another kind of family-focused event is Fairy Fest. And of course, with COVID, we are rethinking how we might do all of this with social distancing and getting some kind of creative thoughts for programming going on. But we are still moving forward with the fairy house competition. And so then we set out people's fairy houses throughout the garden, and other people go and wander and find them and enjoy. And then we also have a long-standing partnership with the local Ikebana Club. And this was their 50th anniversary year, this Mayfest, which was supposed to happen this upcoming weekend, but they have postponed this as well. And more art that we have been featuring. And I don't have a slide for it, so I'm going to tell it here. We are also partnering with 3 veterans groups that come and do art in the garden as a therapeutic program for PTSD recovery. And we're also talking actively with the VA about starting a program of healing garden work where folks in their inpatient program would be brought over with their therapists to use garden work as kind of mindfulness, working mindfulness, to try and clear their brain and create realistic work expectations and good decision making. And we're really excited about that partnership. And I think that out of it, we may end up with some long-term volunteers as well.
You know, that's just on that particular point, Kristin. It's interesting. We had a speaker some months back, Kathleen Wolf from University of Washington, who's a psychologist that focuses on the health benefits of urban landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
And so exactly to what you're speaking to here, I mean, there's no question that given the architecture and just the ornamental landscape that you've created there, how incredibly impressive this could be upon an individual's personality.
Right. I haven't worked with people that are facing homelessness issues directly, but I have worked with folks facing some mental health challenges. And what I find is that just time in the garden lowers their anxiety and improves their thinking skills and their follow through and ability to see detail when some of the stress just washes away. It's really amazing, and it doesn't take that long. So even with a 3 to 6 month inpatient program, I think we stand a chance of being a significant positive force in their life. And that's really why we do this work. You know, we gardeners, didn't set out to make a huge amount of money. We set out to do good work and to change lives. And we love it. So this slide here is one of our new things that we had hoped to launch this coming year. And so these images are not a Lakewold, but are kind of an example of where we're going with our winter lights program. So instead of the type of lighting you might see at the zoo, where it's actual Christmas lights on things, we're hoping to do kind of mood lighting throughout the garden. And we're working with a extremely talented professional lighting designer who's done road shows for the Rolling Stones and work at Burning Man and some pretty impressive production credentials to pull this off. So I am hopeful that we will be open and able to host that this winter. We are also kind of rebooting our little garden shop. So the interior had typically sold kind of traditional gifty items, and we are taking kind of a local artist focus instead and partnering with local talent to produce botanical products specifically for us. And so that we will let folks know when we get to roll that out as well. And it may actually start happening sooner rather than later, because we are doing plant sales by email, where people email their orders and we pull them and then go put them in the parking lot and open the gate and let them come and pick things up. And we may actually try and incorporate some of the interior shop merchandise in that approach as well. And then our cats, we have 2 barn cats that live in the garden, and we stopped putting out rat poison 2 years ago, saved ourselves a ton of money on exterminator service. And these lovely ladies, this is Bells. They are named Bo and Bells after the Bo Bells rhododendron that was Mrs. Wagner's favorite, are doing a wonderful job of bunny control for us. And right now the bunnies are everywhere. I've seen 10 of them in the last 2 days. So the little bits will start appearing soon. But as a result of not putting out the poison, the birds are back. This guy probably wasn't affected, this Junco, but the eagles are back like crazy, and are the owls, if I can get to my next slide. There it is. So our communications coordinator is a big birder, and he's been taking photos in the garden of everything he's seeing. But my experience here has been that we didn't have this kind of bird population when we were putting out the rat poison, and that there is a direct connection between the change in our behavior and the increase in birds.
There's no question about that. In fact, this is a big push that we have as master gardeners on focusing on integrated pest management, so as to avoid the use of chemicals that have deleterious effect across the entire ecosystem. So this is very impressive in terms of the evidence you're seeing of a return to a more natural state.
Yep. And right now with COVID, this is the other thing we're seeing lots of, that, you know, there aren't any people in the garden, so the deer have taken over. So this guy is, this image is probably from 2 months ago, and he's got quite a little rack on him now. And I have to run him out every day, and he's getting more and more bold. Thank you so much for the opportunity to walk and talk visually this way with you about the garden, and I'm open to any questions you might have at this point.
So let's go ahead and stop the screen share so we can see you.
Okay.
And then we get you back into the overall presentation. By the way, this is what a great summary of the program and what's all happening here. What are the COVID plans? Is there any access to the garden at all these days?
There is not at the moment. In fact, we are on seriously reduced staffing. We are either one person on the property or 2 gardeners that are spaced, 5 acres apart as we're working. All of the other staff are working from home at the moment. We are recording, however, our music from home program and going to share that as digital content instead of a live concert. Feel it's really important to keep employing the artists that we made commitments to, and to be sharing positive content with people as they're stuck at home. And we will continue to figure out ways to do that with the rest of our programming if the restrictions stay in place. With the I guess opportunities for outdoor recreation, we are still figuring out where public gardens fall in that, because none of the governor's language has specifically addressed public gardens. A lot of them that fall within park districts probably have clearer direction than we do. But right now, we are honoring the stay home, stay healthy, and staying closed. So
there's no question. So for more information, folks could really just first of all visit the website, because most
Right. Visit our website and then sign up for our e-news, which would then probably get you weekly information on where we are and what our reopening plan will look like. We started a kind of a weekly email called Stories for Home, where we're delving a little bit into stories we might not have had time to tell that provide interesting content for folks and keep them feeling connected to the garden. So that's an opportunity as well.
The shout out I also want to have specifically to our master gardeners viewing this is the educational programs that you offer, or certainly will offer or resume offering,
right,
would be our excellent continuing education opportunities for ourselves. There's some great topics, that I've seen promoted in the workshops that you offer.
Well, thank you for that. We work hard on those. And I agree that they would be great continuing education. I have discovered that every county seems to be set up a little differently in terms of how continuing ed is offered. So I didn't realize that you were able to pick your own. That's wonderful.
Well, indeed, there are indeed guidelines as to what qualifies for that. But exactly to your point is that each county is fairly flexible in terms of what will qualify. And most certainly this year, there's a lot of flexibility that's going to be given to master gardeners across the state in terms of what is indeed need to be pursued. But regardless of that, I think there's this presentation, your discussion here today, has truly brought home to me how important this garden is relative to the heritage of thinking about garden design. Its roots are in very planned, structural English garden type of organization, and it stretches all the way into the naturalistic Hinckley-esque style of nature and function. It's a phenomenal legacy in terms of garden structure.
Yeah, it really is. And then the building I'm sitting in, if you can see behind me, just this rustic space, was the original carriage house on the property. And we are working on a plan to restore this structure and to turn what is currently our storage space for tools and equipment into a classroom, so that there will be even more educational opportunities coming out of this, out of the garden, and trying to be able to utilize the house and a classroom at the same time, so we could even do double programming. So as
Kristin,
much as we can.
With that,
Go ahead.
Kristin, I want to thank you so very much for taking this time on the recording and this time on the presentation. I definitely wanted to again encourage all of the viewers of this to check out the website, sign up for the email list, and absolutely plan a visit for later this summer, when hopefully, right, we'll be released from our quarantine and allowed to visit the gardens. It is great, by the way, knowing that you, Kristin, are there maintaining the garden, protecting them from the bunny munchers and from the deer munchers, right? So that there will be something left to view come summertime.
Yes, and patching the irrigation system up ourselves because our contractors are not working. So yeah, keeping things watered. And yeah, and please do shout out and let me know if you're coming this direction. I would love to take time out and meet you as you're walking through.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Now, again,